Hi, everybody. Today we're going to give an overview and ask a couple questions about Coco Fusco and Paulo Heredia's The Couple in the Cage, Guantinaui Odyssey from 1992. I'm Dylan Perry, one of your TAs. Here's my information. Please feel free to come by during office hours or drop me an email. So, Coco Fusco's and Paulo Heredia's exhibition, The Couple in the Cage. As this summary Elizabeth Ginsburg provided for us makes clear, this was an exhibition that took place in 1992 through 93, and it was an exhibition in which they wanted to make a point at the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. They wanted to sort of make an argument or sort of bring up some tension about indigenous peoples and the honoring of this supposedly important event. And again, indeed, these were performers. They were artist performers. Actors isn't really the right word. You can argue they're acting, but really this is a performance art. And here, of course, we have one of the performers putting on his costume, we could argue, his performance costume. And ultimately, what it led to were this sort of display with modern technology in a golden cage, so to speak, or as Fusco describes it, a golden cage, and modern technology, but also stereotypical or sort of notions of how people might associate concepts of indigeneity on display. And it exhibited everywhere. It exhibited in Madrid, it exhibited in Minneapolis, it exhibited in even the old Whitney Museum on the Upper East Side in New York City. The new Whitney Museum's in Chelsea, but here's a picture of the museum circa 1992. And during these exhibitions, there was a circus-like atmosphere often. We'll get into some of the other reactions in a minute, but the video makes clear, and so does Fusco's sort of overview of it, or assessment of it. There was indeed a sense of circus or display that put people in a certain interesting relationship with what they were looking at, or an amused relationship with what they were visiting or sort of beholding. And indeed, a part of that was taking pictures with the exhibit. So here we have a picture. They talked about how they would charge for the pictures, entering into some sort of financial or commodification of these people and the exhibit. And this is an has a lot of precedent. The notion of taking some indigenous people and putting them on display in some alien environment. This is another still from the video in which a supposedly two sets of cannibals, quote unquote, and that very importantly should be in quotes, were on display in Hollywood in the 1930s. Indeed, this goes back to Columbus's landing, which is an important part of this unit, of course, on Guantinaui, which of course is where they got the name that they used, or is sort of obviously an allusion to the name that the couple in the cage artists used in this piece. And during that time, and this is from Fusco's article, or sort of subsequent to the original arrival or initial arrival, Columbus brought back an Arawak person and who was left on display in the Spanish court for 2 years until he died of sadness. And she goes on to list all sorts of instances in which peoples have been on display in this sort of intercultural performance, as she calls it in her article. Now, people's reactions. Let's talk a lot, and sort of that's what I'm going to focus on in the last couple minutes here, is how people reacted to that and what it means. Now, some people saw it as an art performance. You could argue that in those images we just saw of the people at the Whitney, some of them seem to be treating it as though they're in on the joke, which is not necessarily an excuse for sort of, that still is a complicated question. But there were those that believed that were immediately cynical or skeptical of what this was about and construed it as a performance, or certainly felt as though there was something troubling about what they were seeing. In other words, that it was not simply a circus-like atmosphere. And this is one of the visitors who expressed skepticism and indeed a certain degree of criticism. Now, one argument, and this is from Ginsburg's article, is that the audience actually becomes the object on display during the documentary. While Fusco and Gomez Pena adopted the roles of caged natives, they were simultaneously scrutinizing the audience's responses. That whilst they were gazing at these exhibits, the exhibit was gazing back at them, was looking back at them, and that it put them, the audience, into this relationship in which they might be feeling as though, or they might, in some sort of later context when this video comes, when the documentary comes out, or however, when whatever context ultimately might themselves be an exhibit. However, there is also reactions that were beyond just simply emotion, that were sort of much more complicated than simply believing in the reality of it, or simply having trouble with it, or those who just dismissed it as simply an exhibit. And we'll get into this gentleman's responses to what he sort of witnessed in just a bit. Now, one of those experiences for some was indeed a degree of being very upset, right? That this exhibit was something that was extremely upsetting for some people. And that brings up some of the complicated questions that come up with the intention of displaying the audience. This is Ginsburg's great summary of why some people might have had a problem or one criticism, and they argue it's one reason it didn't work, of the couple in the cage. If they intended it as an open examination of people's beliefs, it is problematic that their performance offered the audience no alternative, no legitimate alternative to enact the role of the subjugating gazer, and in a way, no real agency. The audience couldn't react in a way that dismissed the colonial structure of the encounter. In other words, they were already caught up in being the colonialist the second they entered the exhibition space. And that's one criticism that Ginsburg seems to be raising here. And here we have, and I'm not going to read this whole thing to keep this video a bit shorter. And I'm sorry, by the way, for the clicking that's happening on the video. That's just a quick time thing. I'm still working out. But you had these reactions that were complicated. And in this case, you have somebody who seems to, if not believe in the reality of these people being indigenous, certainly upset that people are photographing it. And one of the discussion questions you'll see involves asking sort of psychologizing or examining why she has this sort of response, which is one that seems to be upset that in her country, people would react the way that they would. Now, this again brings up the idea that these people are performing and sort of kind of like instigating these sorts of reactions, perhaps unexpectedly. Now, what this gentleman says is like very interesting to me because it really is its own experience, and I think it's worth reading out loud. He says that it startled me when I first walked up. I didn't understand exactly what it was until I began to look at the items that are on display, the people that represent the natives of this land. How distorted we have become through the economics and some of the philosophies of life. I could see my own grandchildren in that cage. I think it portrays and really brings home exactly how our people were treated, and I don't know that we're any better off today. This sort of response is its own sort of non-subjugated response, some sort of response that I think is worth keeping in mind as you start thinking about the readings and these videos for this week. His response, I would just encourage you to come back to this part of the video at a later date, or go back to, indeed, the couple in the cage. All right, that's just a brief overview of everything for this week, or just the one video for this week. Speak with you soon.